The night Marcus Vane walked into her coffee shop, Elara Quinn was elbow-deep in espresso grounds and hadn't slept in 31 hours. She almost didn't look up. That was the thing she kept coming back to, later, when everything had already fallen apart and rearranged itself into something she didn't have a name for yet. She almost didn't look up, but she did. He stood at the door like he'd never had to ask permission to enter a room in his life. Late 40s, maybe early 50s. It was hard to tell with men like him, men who'd been built by something harder than age. Dark coat, no tie, the kind of quiet that wasn't peace, but something more like the pause before a storm decides what it's going to destroy. He looked at the chalkboard menu above her head with the same expression a man might use to read a legal document he already knew he was going to sign. "Black coffee," he said. "No sugar." Elara slid it across the counter without a word. He left a 50 on the bar and didn't wait for change. She told herself she forgot about him before the door swung shut. That was a Tuesday. By Friday, she had a problem. Not Marcus Vane, not yet. The problem was a number, $214,000. Written in an invoice from her landlord's attorney, delivered by courier to the back door of grounds, her coffee shop on the corner of Meridian and 5th, the one she'd spent 4 years building from a gutted dry cleaning storefront, and a loan she was still paying off. The letter explained, in language so careful it made her teeth hurt, that the building had been sold, that the new owner was exercising his right to reclaim the commercial space, that her lease, which she'd signed in good faith 3 years ago, had a clause, buried in paragraph 14, subsection C, that permitted exactly this under the right conditions. The right conditions, apparently, being that she was a single mother with a 7-year-old daughter and 0 legal resources. She read the letter 4 times at the kitchen table while Sophie slept in the next room. The 4th time, she cried. The 5th time, she stopped crying and started making a list. Elara Cross had not survived nursing school, a divorce she didn't ask for, and 4 Chicago winters with a baby on her hip by being the kind of woman who stayed on the floor. But $214,000 was not a problem a list could solve. She found out who bought the building through her friend Marisol, who knew someone at the city planning office, who knew someone who'd been at the closing, Marcus Vane. She sat with that name for a long time. Everyone in Chicago knew the name in the way you know the names of things you're not supposed to touch. He wasn't a politician, wasn't a celebrity. He was the kind of man who existed mostly in rumor, the investor who'd bought half a city block in Pilsen before anyone knew it was for sale, the man whose name appeared on 12 different LLCs and none of the headlines, the man who'd had a federal investigation opened and then quietly closed 3 years ago without a single charge filed. Organized crime, people said, the way they said it about a lot of men with too much money and too much silence around them. Nobody could ever prove it. Nobody was especially eager to try. She went to his office anyway. 32nd floor, glass and steel, a receptionist who looked at Elara's peacoat and practical shoes with exactly the kind of polite neutrality that meant she was being assessed and found lacking. Elara gave her name, said she didn't have an appointment, said she wasn't leaving until she spoke with Mr. Vane. She waited 2 hours and 40 minutes. When the receptionist finally waved her through, Marcus Vane was standing at the window with his back to the door, looking at the city like it owed him something. He turned when she came in. His expression didn't change. She recognized him immediately. The man from the coffee shop, the $50 bill, the no sugar, and she watched his face to see if he recognized her. He did. She could tell because he almost didn't let her see it. "Dr. Cross," he said, "not a question. You bought my building. I buy a lot of buildings. You're going to displace me and about 8 other businesses who've been there for years, and I'd like to understand why." He gestured at the chair across from his desk. She didn't sit. "The property has development potential," he said. "It's not personal. It's a coffee shop," she said. "My coffee shop. I built it. I have a daughter in 2nd grade who does her homework at the counter on Wednesdays because I can't afford after-school care on the days I close up late. It's deeply personal, Mr. Vane." Something moved across his face. Not pity, she would have hated that. Something more like attention, real and sudden, like a light coming on in an empty room. "What are you proposing?" he said. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected to be asked to leave. 6 months, she said, before she could lose her nerve. Give me 6 months and I'll find another location and move without a fight. Or give me the option to purchase the space at fair market value, which I know I can't afford, but at least make it an option. She paused. Or explain to me what you actually need the building for, because I've seen the planning filings and I'm not sure you've broken ground on anything in that corridor in 3 years. And I'd like to understand if this is even something you're going to use or if it's just an asset on a spreadsheet. This time the pause was longer. Sit down, Dr. Cross, he said. She sat. She didn't get what she'd asked for. Not exactly. What she got was a conversation that lasted 90 minutes and left her feeling like she'd passed some kind of test she hadn't known she was taking. Marcus Vane was not what she'd prepared for. He was precise where she'd expected bluster, quiet where she'd expected dismissal. He asked about Sophie, how old, what school, and the way he asked it wasn't soft or ingratiating, just direct, like information that mattered. He didn't give her the 6 months. He gave her 11. On one condition, he said. She waited. You consult on the redesign of the commercial space. I need someone who understands what small businesses actually require from a building, not an architect. Someone who's run one. She stared at him for a long moment. That's the condition? That's the condition. She left his office not sure if she'd won something or been maneuvered into giving it away. Marisol, when she called her from the parking garage, said, Elara, the man is a criminal. Allegedly, Elara said. Allegedly is lawyer language for definitely. Elara thought about the way he'd listened, actually listened, not just waited for her to stop talking. She thought about the 11 months, which was 8 more than she'd asked for. I'll be careful, she said. She started working with him 3 weeks later. It was supposed to be professional. It was, for a while, meetings in conference rooms, blueprints on long tables, conversations about load-bearing walls and foot traffic patterns and what a community needs from a commercial corridor. She was good at it, better than she'd expected to be, and she suspected he'd known that from the first conversation in a way she hadn't. He didn't talk much about himself. She wasn't sure she'd call him warm, exactly, but he had a kind of intensity in conversation that felt like the opposite of indifference, like everything she said was landing somewhere, being filed, considered. He remembered things. 3 weeks in, he asked whether Sophie had recovered from the ear infection she'd mentioned in passing at their first meeting. She hadn't realized she'd mentioned it. She couldn't believe he'd remembered. You're not what I expected, she told him once, after a late meeting that had run past 9, and they were the last 2 people in the office. He looked at her steadily. What did you expect? I don't know. Something more, she searched for the word. Transactional. Everything is transactional, he said. The question is what you're actually trading. She thought about that for a long time afterward. It was Marisol who found the article. 3 inches of column space in a 7-year-old issue of the Tribune, buried in the business section. Vane Construction linked to Delgado Organization, sources say. The Delgado Organization had been a mid-tier crime syndicate operating out of the West Side in the 2010s. Broken up in 2019 after a RICO case that had netted 14 convictions, none of them Marcus Vane. He walked, Marisol said, sliding the printout across her kitchen table. He was never charged. Elara, I know. She did know. She wasn't naive. But she'd also sat across from him twice a week for 6 weeks, and she couldn't reconcile the man in the article, the shadow, the implication, the unnamed associate, with the man who'd rearranged a meeting because she'd texted that Sophie had a fever and she needed to stay home. She kept both things in her head and didn't resolve them. The line moved in November. It was raining, one of those Chicago rains that came sideways off the lake and meant business, and she'd shown up at his building for a late meeting and found the office empty except for him, and he'd had dinner ordered in because apparently that was something he did, made decisions about practical matters without asking. Not because he was inconsiderate, but because he'd already calculated what was needed and acted on it. She sat down across from him at the conference table with takeout containers between them and a set of blueprints she'd annotated the night before, and somewhere in the middle of arguing about ventilation systems and window placement, she realized she was happy. not relieved, not comfortable. Happy. The specific kind that felt unfamiliar and almost dangerous, like finding footing on ice. She went home that night and lay in the dark and told herself it was nothing, that he was not a man she could afford to feel things about, that she had Sophie and the shop and a future she was building carefully, and she could not afford the kind of disruption that a man like Marcus Vane would represent. She believed all of that. She kept showing up anyway. He kissed her for the first time in the parking garage of his building on a Wednesday in December. She'd said something that made him laugh, actually laugh, not the controlled half-smile he usually gave. And when she looked up at him, the expression on his face was so unguarded that she forgot for a moment to protect herself. She kissed him back. She drove home in a car that felt different somehow, charged, like the weather had changed. She picked up Sophie from her mom's house and stood in the kitchen making grilled cheese and tried to think straight. She couldn't think straight. Sophie, 7 years old and possessed of the forensic instincts of a very small detective, looked up from her drawing at the kitchen table and said, "Mama, why do you look weird?" "I don't look weird. You look like when you got the call about the lease thing, but opposite." Elara turned back to the stove. "Eat your dinner, baby." She should have expected the thing with Devon. Devon Cross, her ex-husband, Sophie's father, a man she'd once loved with the uncomplicated certainty of someone who'd never been truly hurt yet, had a way of materializing at the worst possible moments. He'd been in and out of Sophie's life in the unreliable way of men who meant well in the abstract but couldn't sustain it in practice. And in January he came back, not for Sophie, as it turned out, for Marcus. She found out the way she found out most things that blindsided her. From Marisol, who'd heard it from someone at a downtown bar, who'd seen Devon talking to a man named Reyes, who worked for a law firm that was, allegedly, everything was always allegedly, connected to people who were interested in what Marcus Vane was doing and with whom. "Devon is talking to people who are building a case against Marcus," Marisol said, "and Devon knows you're involved with him." The cold that moved through her wasn't about Marcus. Not first. It was about Sophie, her daughter's father, the man who was supposed to love her unconditionally, using their proximity to Marcus to leverage something. She didn't know what. She didn't need to know what. She went to Marcus's office the next morning. She didn't call ahead. He was in a meeting. She waited. When he came out and saw her face, he ended the meeting. "Devon Cross has been talking to people about you," she said when they were alone. "I don't know what he told them. I don't know what he knows, or thinks he knows. But I needed you to hear it from me before you heard it from someone else." He was quiet for a long time. She watched his face do the thing it did when he was processing something. A stillness that wasn't blankness, but something more like depth, the way deep water looked still even when there was a current. "I know," he said. She stared at him. "I've known for about 3 weeks. I was trying to determine how to handle it without involving you, without involving me. Marcus, it's my ex-husband, which is exactly why I didn't want you in the middle of it." She stood up, sat back down. She was angry, and the anger was complicated, because part of it was relief that he'd been protecting her, and the other part was the particular fury of someone who'd spent 4 years making every hard decision alone and did not appreciate being managed, even kindly. "Don't do that," she said. "Don't make decisions about what I need to know about my own life. Elara, I'm not a building. You don't get to acquire me and then optimize me without my input." The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, almost. "Is that what you think I've been doing? I think you're someone who's spent a very long time controlling every variable in every situation, and I think you haven't figured out yet that I'm not a variable." The silence stretched out between them. Outside the window, Chicago was gray and cold and indifferent to whatever was happening in this room. "You're right," he said finally, quietly. "I'm sorry." She hadn't expected that either. Devon, it turned out, had made a deal with federal investigators who were building a new case that was tangential to the old RICO matter, looking at money movement through a series of shell companies, some of which had at one point been connected to Marcus through a business partner who'd since been convicted of tax fraud. Devon had been picked up for an unrelated financial violation, and had offered up information about Marcus in exchange for leniency. The information was thin. The case was thinner. But Devon had added something else to his cooperation agreement. He'd told them that Marcus Vane was in a relationship with his ex-wife, who had access to records connected to the Meridian Street development. He'd tried to make Elara into an angle. She found this out from Marcus, who told her everything now, not because he'd transformed overnight into someone who found disclosure easy, but because she'd asked him to, and he'd understood what it cost her to need that from someone and chosen to give it. The records they want don't show what they think they show, he said. My attorney is handling it. Devon's cooperation isn't going to lead anywhere because there's nothing to find. And the rest of it? She asked. The stuff from before, the Delgado connection. Another silence. Longer this time. I was 26, he said. I took construction contracts from people I shouldn't have done business with because I needed the capital, and I told myself the source didn't matter. I wasn't in the organization. I wasn't involved in what they did. But I knew who they were, and I took their money and I built things with it. And I've spent 15 years building things without that money, and I can't undo the 15 years before that. She sat with that for a while. Did anyone get hurt? She said. Because of you, directly. No, she believed him. She wasn't sure that made it simple. She wasn't sure anything about this was simple. I need you to understand, he said, that I can't make you a guarantee. I can tell you who I am now, and what I've built, and what I've spent the last decade trying to do differently. I can't retroactively clean up my history. I know, she said. Elara. He waited until she looked at him. I'm not asking you to forgive something I don't deserve forgiveness for. I'm asking you to decide whether what I am now is enough. She didn't answer him that night. She picked up Sophie from school, and they walked home even though it was cold, taking the long way, the way that went past the park, where Sophie liked to check on the same specific squirrel she'd named Gerald. Gerald was there. Sophie narrated his activities with the serious dedication of a nature documentarian. Elara walked beside her daughter and thought about what it meant to decide something, not react to it, not survive it, actually decide. She'd been surviving for 4 years, moving from one hard thing to the next, with her head down and her lists and her early mornings and her belief that forward motion was the same thing as progress. She thought about the version of Marcus she'd expected when she walked into his office that first day, and the version she'd found and the distance between them. She thought about the way he'd listened, the 11 months, the dinner he'd ordered without asking because he'd already thought through what was practical. She thought about his face when she'd said, I'm not a variable, and the way he'd said, you're right, like someone who'd learned to mean it by doing something harder first. She thought about the things he couldn't undo. She thought about Devon, who'd tried to turn her into a weapon and called it cooperation. Mama, Sophie said, watching Gerald execute an ambitious leap between branches, do you think squirrels are scared when they jump? Elara considered this seriously, the way Sophie liked things to be considered. I think they do it so many times that the fear becomes part of the motion, she said, like they've learned that scared and ready feel the same. Sophie nodded, like this was exactly the answer she'd expected. She went back to Marcus the next morning. He was in his office, and he looked like a man who'd been awake for a long time, which she recognized because she'd worn the same face herself for months on end. He didn't say anything when she came in. He waited. I'm not interested in your past, she said. I mean that in the specific sense that I've made my assessment, and I've decided I'm not going to use it against you. But I'm also not interested in pretending it doesn't exist, and I need to know that you understand those are two different things. I understand, he said. And Devon. She took a breath. What he did, that's not something I can fix. Sophie is still his daughter, and that means I have to figure out how to handle a man who betrayed me in the specific way that only people who know your vulnerabilities can. I'm going to need time to do that. It might be ugly. It might affect things around us. It won't affect us, he said. You don't know that. No, he said. But I know that I'm not going anywhere, and I know that Sophie is not a complication. She's part of what you are. That's not something I'm tolerating. It's something I. He stopped. Started again, which she'd learned meant something, because he was not a man who started things over. It's something I want to be part of, if you'll allow it. She looked at him for a long moment. The city was bright outside the windows, one of those cold February days where the sun came out as if to apologize for the past 3 months. "Gerald is a squirrel," she said. He blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Sophie's squirrel. In the park on Olmsted. She's named him Gerald, and she has very detailed theories about his schedule and his emotional life. And she will want to tell you about him at length the first time she meets you, and you are going to have to engage with this genuinely, not just be polite." He didn't laugh. He looked at her with something in his face that was more serious than a laugh, more specific. "I can do that," he said. The federal case dissolved in March. Devon's information hadn't led anywhere, because, as Marcus had said, there was nothing to find, and the cooperation agreement lapsed. Devon sent a text to Elara that she didn't respond to. He sent one to Sophie's number 2 weeks later that said, "I'm sorry, bug," and Sophie read it and put the phone face down on the table and went back to her drawing without comment. 7 years old, and already so much better at self-protection than Elara had been at 32. She hugged her daughter and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do is just be present in the room while someone decides how they feel. The Meridian Street development opened in September. She'd found a new location for grounds 4 blocks north, a corner space with better light, and Marcus had made sure of this, though he'd done it through an intermediary so she wouldn't feel obligated, a lease with no buried clauses. She'd spent the spring building it out, and by August it was better than what she'd had. More space, a small stage for the acoustic nights she'd always wanted to host, a corner that Sophie had claimed as her homework territory and furnished with a beanbag chair and a stern handwritten sign that said, "Work happening. Do not disturb, except Mama." At the opening of the Meridian project, there was a small plaque in the lobby of the redesigned building. It acknowledged the community consultation that had shaped the commercial design. It didn't name her specifically. She'd asked for that. But Marcus had added a line at the bottom, in smaller text, that she read standing in the lobby surrounded by people she didn't know. For the people who showed up when they had no reason to expect anything. She stood there for a moment. He appeared beside her without fanfare, the way he had a habit of doing, as if approach and announcement were ceremonies he'd decided to skip. "Is that about me?" she said. "It's about anyone who reads it and recognizes themselves," he said. "That's how language works. That's very convenient. I'm a practical man." She looked at the plaque again. Then she looked at him, this man who had come into her life as a threat and become something she still didn't have the exact right word for, something that was made of all the things she'd expected and none of them, something that had cost her real things and given her real things, and had not once, in the 11 months she'd known him, pretended to be easier than he was. She thought about squirrels, the way Scared and Ready could feel the same. "Sophie wants to know," she said, "if Gerald can come to Thanksgiving." He looked at her. "Gerald is a squirrel. She's very attached." "I'm aware. She told me about him for 40 minutes on Saturday, and you engaged with it genuinely, not just politely." "I asked follow-up questions," he said with great dignity. "Several." She laughed, the real kind, the kind that surprised her sometimes with how easy it had gotten. He looked at her when she laughed and she could see it, the thing that was still there even now, that quiet fullness in his face, like a man who's learned to be careful about what he lets himself want and has decided deliberately to stop being careful about this. She took his hand. His fingers closed around hers. Outside, the city went about its business, indifferent and enormous, the way it always had. She was 34 years old with a coffee shop and a daughter who'd named a squirrel and a past she'd survived, and a future she hadn't yet figured out how to describe, and she was standing in a lobby with a man who'd started as the wrong thing and turned into something she didn't have a name for yet. She decided she could learn to live without the name.